Meet the Press with Hugh Rimmington.
Hello and welcome to the new carbon-priced world. It is July the 1st and off we go. The carbon tax and the mining tax on big coal and iron ore producers, that's also in today. But the biggest deliberate shift to our economy, at least since the GST, has been overshadowed in recent days.
I believe the time for the party divide on this issue is at an end. We have seen too much tragedy.
And we may yet see more. For all the intensity and emotion of the asylum seeker debate in Parliament, nothing was settled.
There are no measures deployed by governments in the battle against people smuggling which are particularly palatable. They all have aspects which are cruel.
So deciding on the least worst level of cruelty defeated the Parliament. The Prime Minister looking now to a panel headed by former Defence Chief Angus Houston after the Senate rejected the Malaysia swap deal so trenchantly opposed by the Coalition and the Greens.
The proposed Malaysian solution, what a hideous term it is in fact a trade in human flesh.
We have a bill that rips up the Refugee Convention. It would allow future governments to send people to Syria, Iraq or Afghanistan.
I will never, ever support a people swap where you can send a 13-year-old child unaccompanied to a country without supervision.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah.
It'll be over my dead body.
Sadly, dead bodies are not in short supply. And while that issue gnaws at our soul, Australians will also be looking to their wallets, their power bills, their job prospects as the carbon tax from today begins its work.
They're all gone from Sunday. Nearly 200,000 jobs gone from Sunday, forecast by the Prophet of Doom.
The architect of carbon pricing, Greg Combet, is our guest today. And later,
stop the deaths and make that the focus.
Independent MP Rob Oakeshott will join us. But first, here's Melanie Davies with what's making news this winter Sunday, July the 1st.
Thanks, Hugh. Good morning. The controversial carbon tax officially comes into force today. Levied on about 300 of the biggest polluters in the country, costs are expected to be passed on through the economy. The Prime Minister has been out easing fears, saying most families will be better off under her compensation scheme. But the federal opposition still vows it will axe the tax if it wins government. International envoy Kofi Annan has brokered an agreement for a plan for transitional government in Syria, but it may include a role for President Bashar al-Assad. Russia, supported by China, has refused to back a provision calling for Assad to step aside, despite US requests. And Cadel Evans has begun his Tour de France title defence with the 13th fastest time in the prologue at Liège in Belgium. He was 17 seconds behind the winner, Swiss star Fabian Cancellara. The top-placed Australian was Brett Lancaster, who finished 6th for the new Orica Green Edge team. And Hugh, those are the top stories this morning.
Melanie, thank you. And now welcome back to the program, Greg Combet. Good morning, Minister.
How are you, Hugh?
Oh, look, I'm doing all right. More to the point, how are you? You've put a lot of work into getting to this day. How's it feel this morning?
Well, astonishingly, given the prophecies of doom from Tony Abbott, it looks like the sun's come up okay, and I'm getting reports from all around the country that life is going on as normal. We've seen some video evidence from Whyalla that it hasn't been wiped off the map, and indeed heard some evidence that people have gone to supermarkets already and there's no price increases to be seen. So life as normal, which is exactly what we suggested.
The first few hours seem to have got by okay then, but on all the available evidence, people right now hate this tax. How do you turn that around?
Well, I think we're moving, of course, from the fiction that Tony Abbott and others have created over the last 18 months to a position from today where people will be able to test their experience against the facts, what it's really like. And, of course, it'll be very, very modest price impact. We are providing tax cuts, pension increases, increases in family tax benefits and many other payments to people so that averaged across all households there's about $10.10 a week extra in assistance. Industries are going well. The coal industry will not be wiped off the map as Tony Abbott forecast, and this will be an environmentally effective scheme. It will cut our greenhouse gas emissions.
OK, that's well and good, but the tax will cut emissions by coming down hard on what are polluting industries. If we take just one example, for example, the aluminium industry, a question from Tony Abbott to the Prime Minister in Parliament. I'll put it to you too. First of all, here it is.
Will the Prime Minister confirm that the government's own carbon tax modelling forecasts a 61% reduction in aluminium production as a result of her tax?
It does, doesn't it, by 2050 mean heavy reductions in aluminium, and that means jobs and industry going offshore or shutting down completely.
No, well, it's misleading the way that he's put that particular question. And what we're facing in the aluminium industry at the moment, as you can see in some of the public commentary, is that the industry is under great pressure, which has nothing to do with carbon pricing. It's everything to do with global oversupply, low aluminium prices and the high value of the Australian dollar.
OK, so those are separate pressures on aluminium, but the fact is that the carbon price is about those high energy intensive industries like aluminium. That's the purpose of the thing. So what's misleading about him quoting back your modelling that is the effect of the carbon tax on aluminium, just to take that industry?
Well, because the modelling is very comprehensive and takes into account all of these issues and looks at, against a business as usual case for making forecasts about the long-term future, and that's the Treasury modelling took those positions out to 2050, and there are significant international factors. For example, the massive expansion of aluminium smelting in China and the fact that aluminium companies are moving their aluminium smelting operations to countries where there are very low emissions electricity sources, gas and renewable energy sources in particular. It's a very energy-intensive commodity to produce aluminium, and
you can't get aluminium out of renewables, though, can you?
Well, yes, you can. Hydroelectric power will provide the electricity that's necessary, for example, to produce aluminium, and does so in many countries. That's one of the reasons why Norway, for example, is a very active producer and corporate player in the aluminium sector.
OK, well, the opposition has already said that it will axe the tax, if you like, and in fact they've today given a timetable of 6 months to get it in, if necessary going to a double dissolution election, if they were to win the next election and Labor was to resist the reform of this tax. Presumably they've got an alternative. They've spoken about direct action. What would be the consequences of that, do you think?
Well, firstly, let me say that Tony Abbott can't and won't repeal the carbon pricing scheme, and it's not in their national interest that he do so. And if he were to attempt to do so, even assuming he was able to win the next election, he's going to have to cut taxes, put up taxes, I should say, cut pension increases, cut family tax benefits, etc., to pay for it. But it won't happen, and this is an issue that Labor has stood up for a long time. We do, as a country, have to cut our greenhouse gas emissions as part of an international effort to tackle climate change.
It sounds like you're bound for a double dissolution election then on, you know, if you're saying that you won't let it happen, if they were to win the next election, you're saying that you wouldn't accept a mandate to get rid of the tax.
Well, we'll fight for what we believe in, and we have to be part of an international effort to tackle climate change. But again, Hugh, you're giving the next election away already. Sure, we mightn't be travelling that well in the polls at the moment, but I can tell you what, we're going to fight for what we believe in and fight to win the next election. But even if Tony Abbott gets in to government in that event, unfortunate event, then he can't and he won't be repealing the carbon price mechanism. And even if he puts his own policy into action, this so-called direct action policy, that's, you know, to deploy solar panels on rooftops and plant trees and buy emissions reductions from large polluters. Guess how that's paid for? Out of people's taxes. And guess what the cost of deploying solar panels on people's rooftops costs per tonne of greenhouse gas emissions that's reduced? Anything up to $400 a tonne of greenhouse gas emissions that are reduced. In fact, it's a massively greater cost, his policy, and none of that's been tested yet. The reason that the government has gone down the path that it has is that it is much, much cheaper to be able to do so, and it's the big polluters that pay, and we're using most of that revenue to give to households. OK, we're going to take a break. We'll be back with the panel in just a moment or two. There were a few, it has to be said, light-hearted moments in the past week, but we did have some sympathy for Labor's Graham Perrott turning up barefoot for one vote in the chamber, caught out while getting dressed up, apparently, for Parliament's midwinter ball.
And it wasn't the only time the division bells interrupted his evening.
Why doesn't Labor just compromise on this one to win the bigger point?
Sorry, I have to go and try and save some lives. I can't say that very often, but the vote's on right now.
OK, Graham, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for joining us. First time that's happened on a
Right, there you go. Oh,
Welcome back. This is Meet the Press. Greg Combet is our guest, and welcome now to our panel. Karen Middleton from SBS, Jessica Wright from Fairfax. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning, Hugh. Minister, you've got 3 years of a fixed carbon price before you move to a trading system. Now, you can't control the world's financial climate any more than you can control the weather. If you're in a situation where businesses are going under, are feeling too much pressure, how much room is there for you to either tweak the system or give them more money?
Well, let's just step back from that for a second and have a look at the state of the economy. It's growing at 4.3%, unemployment's around 5%, interest rates have come down, we're one of the best performing economies in the world, and the outlook for Australian business is strong. Yes, there are pressures in some sectors, in particular in manufacturing, and we have policy settings in place to relieve some of that pressure. But we are in good shape, and the way that we have set this carbon price scheme up takes into account the state of the economy, and we believe that it is an entirely feasible and economically responsible policy measure.
Mind you,
because at the end of the day,
John Howard, when he brought in the GST, said the same thing. He had to tweak it. They had to change the compliance issues for business in particular because there was revolt out there. Are you saying there will be no shift to the carbon price from here, that you're totally locked in on all elements of it?
Well, if some tweaking is justified, of course we'll consider it, but it's been debated for 4 years essentially in great detail with the business community, and people understand exactly what it involves in the business community, and we think we've got the settings right, Hugh, and it is an entirely manageable economic reform, and at the end of the day it's important in the long term because it will help ensure the competitiveness of our economy, and our major trading partners in the Asia-Pacific region are doing similar things and expecting us to do the same.
But you've also got an opposition that says that pledges to repeal this legislation if it wins. The polls are suggesting at the moment that it's in front well and truly. So business is anticipating the real possibility that this system's only going to be in place for a short time. Isn't that a drawback? Isn't that a problem in terms of getting them to restructure the way you want them to now?
Well, it's a problem for businesses having certainty, but can I state this very clearly? Tony Abbott can't and he won't repeal the carbon price mechanism.
Well, he says he can,
this
and
is
he
a
will.
Reform. Well, not much that Tony Abbott says is to be believed. He said the coal industry would be destroyed from today. Just have a look I'll be visiting a coal mine later today. It's working. I've checked in. Whyala's still here. He said they'd be wiped off the map. He said there'd be unimaginable price increases, and Coles and Woolies haven't put their prices up. Tony Abbott's not to be believed, and he's about to be found out.
Well, good morning, Minister. But the sun did rise today, but all doom and gloom jokes aside, is it naive to assume that Tony Abbott's campaign against this tax is going to lose any potency in the run-up to the election? You know what a good fear campaign did. You ran Work Choices and that delivered you the 07 election.
Well, Work Choices campaign that I headed up at the ACTU, we ran on facts and on people's lived experience, the actuality of them being sacked in the workplace. We didn't exaggerate a thing, whereas Tony Abbott's been running a fear campaign based on fiction, and now from today we're moving to factual assessment of his claims. And people in Australia are practical people. They'll test this against their real experience. They'll have heard all the nonsense that's gone on over the last 18 months. They'll now check it against the lived experience, the reality of it. And I think they'll find that Tony Abbott's really been outrageously misleading and deceitful.
OK, Greg Combet, I'd like to take you on to the other big issue, that's the asylum seeker issue. The impasse is now, the logjam almost completely is almost complete. There is the expert panel now re-examining the whole issue, but whatever they find, Tony Abbott is suggesting it won't shift the parliamentary numbers. Here's what he said.
The coalition doesn't need an expert committee to tell us what our policy is, because we have a policy, and it's a policy that we will stick to.
Minister, what was the point of bringing this legislation in the way you did, with no warning, when you knew everybody's positions were fixed and really we ended up after 2 days of debate with no change?
Well, everybody's positions weren't fixed. There was quite a significant shift in sentiment in the Parliament in the light of the tragic circumstances of so many people losing their lives over the last week or so, and that's why the bill that was put forward, which is a compromise bill put forward by Rob Oakeshott, an independent, was ultimately carried through the House of Representatives. It's because positions did change. But I tell you, I am totally disgusted by the position that Tony Abbott and the Greens took in the Senate to defeat that bill, because it leaves us in a position of not being able to prevent more people being killed at sea in these boats. And that ultimately is the critical test. And Tony Abbott, what we just heard from him in that clip, is his total intransigence, his total aggression, his total negativity and his total disregard for the consequences of his actions.
But Minister,
and we've got to hold him to account for that.
The fact is here, you've got all the evidence that you need from the opposition and the Greens that Malaysia is out. They're not going to move on this. You're the government. When are you going to bring legislation to the Parliament that has a chance of passing both the House of Representatives and the Senate? Do you think that an inquiry, the people smugglers are going to look at the inquiry and think, that's it, our model's broken, no more boats?
Look, the government shifted its position. The legislation that went through the House of Representatives allows both the Coalition's policy to be implemented and the government's policy to be implemented. We supported an independence bill to shift. You know, we shifted to that position to get that through the Parliament. Andrew Wilkie supported it at the end of the day and, you know, had struggled with his conscience. It's a very difficult issue, but there needs to be movement from the Greens and the Coalition on this issue, because the one really critical test is what is the policy position that will give the maximum chance of people not dying at sea. And getting this bill that went through the House of Reps ultimately through the Senate is important in that regard. I think the Prime Minister has responded very sensibly by now saying, in light of that intransigence, to ask Air Chief Marshal Houston, who is a person of unimpeachable character, and Paris Aristotle, who's well known in this field, and Michael Lestrange, a very experienced diplomat, to have a look at these issues and to report to the Parliament what we need to do, because we've really got to get past the politics with this and place some value on people's lives and try and stop people getting on these boats.
All right, we'll see how much it actually shifts any parliamentary views once they come back with it. We've got Rob Oakeshott coming up next, but Minister Greg Combet, thanks very much for joining us on this day of all days.
Thanks for having me on, Hugh.
Now, David Pope in the Canberra Times captured the asylum seeker debate as it went round in circles.
I think we're starting to gain on them.
Welcome back. This is Meet the Press. Independent Rob Oakeshott has been pivotal to this Parliament, and he was front and centre again as his compromise bill on asylum seekers passed the House of Reps. He then, vainly as it turned out, urged the Senate to pass it too.
I do not want to go home to my electorate, going back to the previous question, with the intolerable situation of inaction. That is a disgrace.
Well, he is back in his electorate. Rob Oakeshott joins us now from the Port Macquarie racetrack. Good morning to you, Rob.
Hi, Hugh.
Good morning, Rob. You've said it's a disgrace, and we've had evidence that Parliament as a vehicle to solve problems is now broken. You are a key independent. Is it not time now to call it? Have you considered perhaps standing down, bringing this Parliament to an election so problems like this can be solved once and for all?
Well, thanks for the question. The Parliament I'm in is the House of Representatives, and it did its work this week. It gave the green light in the green room. The problem was in the red room, which gave the red light to this, and I think that was all played out very publicly. And a change of government will not change the stalemate. So it's certainly crossed the mind, but in the end, it doesn't fix the problem.
Seriously did it cross your mind?
What we've got is three political parties, what we've got is three political parties in the Senate in a deadlock. Two of them are working against the other, whichever of the options you go in the lower house, and two of them, whichever two, have got to start to work to get issues resolved rather than to block.
Your legislation was brought forward effectively on the government's timing this week. It seems that way anyway. How much is your agenda and your legislation being hijacked by the government's politics. Are you concerned about that?
Oh, look, this bill was brought in February, so it had got through to a third reading stage in a technical sense, so it had to come on for a vote at some stage. You're right that the Prime Minister chose to bring it on when the second vote went down on Wednesday. And then I will push, and did push as hard as I could to get it through. Happening in parallel this week, though, was something of more significance, and that is based on a Liberal member, Mal Wash's comments last weekend. A group of 6 members across party lines met on Monday. That grew in an extraordinary way to 42 members by Wednesday, and that work is going to continue. So out of this work, yes, there's frustration we don't have legislation, but what we do have now is a 6-week window where the government has to deliver through Angus Houston, or this issue will be resolved by other means when Parliament comes back. And as well, we've got this cross-parliamentary group meeting in the winter break. There will also be a ginger group on all leadership to try and get this issue resolved.
When did the Prime Minister tell you that she wanted you to bring that bill in? And given that positions were fixed, particularly from the opposition and the Greens, what was the point of doing that? Did you have any concern about bringing it on so quickly?
The bill's technically before the House already, so it's out of my control. This goes back to February when I introduced it. It went through its second read, and if you recall, a couple of months ago there was a tied vote that the Deputy Speaker allowed it to progress to this third read.
But when did she tell you she wanted it on now?
Technically, it's not my bill. Sorry?
When did she tell you she wanted to bring it on straight away?
Essentially after the second vote went down on Wednesday. So that period between, it was around lunchtime on Wednesday and 2 o'clock when the bill is brought on. But be clear, I don't bring it on. It is in the hands of the Leader of the House and the Parliamentary Chamber to decide when that third read happens. Now, they chose to bring it on quicker than what I expected. When they did, of course, I'm going to defend it and try and get it through as much as I can. I was pleased the House of Reps did its work and got it through. Everyone got to see the negotiations going on over those 7 hours and who's talking to who. So as a secondary thing that's come out of this week, there's nowhere to hide now for those that are clearly negotiating together to try and run interference. And I particularly target the Greens and the Liberal National Party, who there on the floor of the House of Reps were working to block.
So you're saying that
there was a window where it looked like they had a deal, but it looks like it all went to mush. And I think there. So are you saying, just to be clear, Mr. Oakeshott, are you saying that they're running that wasn't sincere? There was no sincerity to that process. They're simply running interference? Well, what have we got at the end of the week? We've got nothing. There was a window there for about an hour where it did look like there was consensus and some people willing to give, but in the end something went wrong, and at the end of the week we go home with nothing and an issue unresolved and a lot of frustrated Australians.
Mr. Oakeshott, you are home now. You've said you didn't want to return to the electorate. You've got 6 weeks till Parliament resumes. This is the start of the dry season up north. There is an expected influx of boats. Would you support Parliament being recalled if we have yet another disaster on our hands? I mean, you've said you didn't want to go back to it with the threat of another disaster happening. What next?
Oh, regardless of whether there's another boat that goes in the water, we've got a policy disaster on our hands. So, yes, I'd go back to Canberra tomorrow if it wanted to be recalled. But that is the Prime Minister and the Leader of the House call. In the end, though, I've also made a comment at the end of the week that I hope everyone is very clear that this isn't a House of Reps issue. The Green Room gave the green light. This is a Senate issue. So if anyone needs to be recalled, it's the senators who could have done something this week and didn't. And it is in the Senate that has now clearly not dropped its constitutional role as a House of Review or the State's House, and is now nothing more than a political party's house. That is where the problem is. That is where the deadlock is. If anyone needs to be recalled, and if anyone is wondering where to apply pressure, it is to the senators of Australia who have clearly put their political parties before their country this week. It is time they started to talk. It is time they resolved this issue.
Rob Oakeshott, thank you very much for joining us. 6 weeks to try to find a resolution to this before Parliament comes back. The world watches, certainly everyone in Australia. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks also to our panel, Karen and Jessica. And a transcript of this program will be on our website and our Facebook page. You can see the show again, if you like, on our website. So till next week, goodbye.